Destiny. Part 2. Beyond the Walls. Chapter 13. Knock knock. The day after the coup, Yushme's condition had stabilized, though he agonized over what had happened because of his actions. For the first time, he went outside and saw what Yolendas had been up to. There were archers up on the walls, trebuchets and ballisters at the ready, and pilgrims now acting as soldiers and prepping for battle. Infuriated, Yushime found Yolendas. "Do you think I am a fool, Yolendas?" cried Yushime. "You orchestrated all of this right from the beginning." "You think I orchestrated all this? Why?" "Because I seized an opportunity when it presented itself, and that I think quickly when I need to," snarled Yolendas. "This is bigger than you, Yushime. It has been a long time in the making." Before Yushime could respond, the sharp blast of a horn echoed through the air, followed by a shout from the eastern wall. "The COL army approaches," a guard cried out. "I have to surrender to them," Yushime exclaimed, his voice shaking. "Maybe if I turn myself in, they'll release the pilgrims." "Absolute nonsense," Yolendas interrupted, cutting him off. "They'll kill you and imprison them anyway." He turned toward the wall, his expression cold as he took in the enemy's movements. The enemy army halted just outside arrow range. 3 horsemen rode forward, their eyes fixed on the parapets. One of them called out, his voice clear and demanding, "We seek to speak with whoever leads, here." Yolendas stepped forward without hesitation. "If you so much as fire a single arrow or attempt to breach the walls, we will destroy the food stores." The rider's response was swift and unwavering. "You have 3 days to hand over your leader and this rabble-rousing village father, or we will attack and everyone involved will pay the price." Yolendas' lips twisted into a mocking grin. "Then attack now. We've already kindled the fire." As the horsemen withdrew, Yolendas descended from the wall to find Yushime at the eastern gate, speaking urgently to the guards. His hands were outstretched in a gesture of desperation. "What in the name of the gods do you think you're doing?" Yolendas demanded. "I heard what they said. If I give myself up, they'll let the pilgrims go free," Yushime replied, his voice strained. "They want both of us," Yolendas retorted sharply. "Do you honestly believe they'll just let these people, these rioters, walk away scot-free as though nothing happened?" Yushime's gaze dropped to the ground, his fingers clenching at his sides. "I don't know. Maybe not. But right now, it's the only thing I can do to keep them from harm." He looked up, eyes filled with the weight of responsibility. "Whether you choose to surrender is your decision, but you must live with it. I can only hope you choose wisely." Yolendas' face darkened. "Don't be hasty. They gave us 3 days. We can't act on panic. Just wait 1 more day, see what happens." Yushime shook his head, his voice resolute. "A day is too long. Tensions will rise, mistakes will be made. Every minute we delay increases the risk of catastrophe." "A catastrophe is a real possibility," Yolendas acknowledged, his expression unreadable. "But miracles are possible, too." Yushime's frustration flared again, his steps quick and agitated as he paced. "What do you know of miracles? You only deal in strategies, in games of power." Yolendas' gaze softened, though his tone remained firm. "Give me 1 more day. If by the 3rd day nothing has changed, I promise you, we'll walk out together. I'll keep my word." Yushime paused, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He gazed upward at the blue clear skies and whispered some brief utterance into the wind. He met Yolendas' gaze, searching for any sign of deceit. "Do I have your word?" he asked quietly. Yolendas nodded solemnly. "You have my word." They shook hands, the agreement sealed not in trust, but in necessity. Milo and Ellie crouched behind a cluster of jagged rocks, watching as 5 figures emerged from the winding path. 3 men and 2 women stopped in their tracks, their voices rising in heated argument. "That's Losgrel and Longfellow," Milo whispered, his eyes narrowing. Ellie studied the others carefully. "And the rest are Wolflandians, but they do not look like Raybor's people." "They must be headed to the gathering," Milo murmured, shifting to stand. "Let's show ourselves." Ellie gripped his arm, her voice low. "Hold on. I don't want word getting back to Raybor or the king that I'm still alive." With a subtle motion, she withdrew a wand from her cloak. She waved it over her face 3 times, muttering a string of foreign words. A mist began to rise, swirling around her features. As it thickened, the mist twisted into silver, gray, and black flecks, merging to form a mask that obscured her face entirely. When it cleared, Ellie had vanished, replaced by a mysterious figure whose presence made Milo shiver. "All right, call to your friends," she whispered, her voice low but firm. Milo hesitated but then stood, raising his arms and shouting, "Losgrel, Longfellow, over here." The group froze. Instantly, swords and staffs were raised, their hands tense, ready to strike. "It's okay. He is a friend," said Losgrel as he strode toward Milo. Just then, Ellie stepped out from behind the rocks. Losgrel froze, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "Milo, who is this?" Losgrel asked, his voice cautious. "This is Grimar, Milo said, gesturing toward Ellie. A wizard. Losgrel took a measured step forward, eyes still locked on Grimar. He shook Milo's hand, his grip firm. Longfellow followed, pulling Milo into a quick, enthusiastic hug. You must be headed to the gathering, Losgrel said. Milo glanced at Ellie. She gave a subtle nod. Yes, and I assume you're as well? Well, we're trying, Longfellow said with a rueful grin. Ellie turned to Milo and murmured something under her breath. How did you end up here, traveling with them? Milo asked, his gaze shifting between Longfellow and the others. Burdock sent us out to seek help from Tyravant and Wolflandia. Tyravant remained neutral, but Wolflandia wished to have representation at the gathering, so they sent us in hopes that we could get them in, with the help of Burdock's letter. A dark-skinned man with a flowing cape, Duintas, stepped forward and extended a gloved hand to Milo. I am Duintas, he said with a smile, nodding toward a young woman beside him. And this is Hyzia. The woman was hooded, her face marked with strange tattoos, her ears adorned with ornate jewelry. Duintas gestured to the last figure, a tall woman with striking dark skin, her attention seemingly elsewhere. This is Destira, our guide. Destira tapped her compass several times before looking up. This is the third time we've crossed this clearing, she said, a note of frustration in her voice. Every time we're close to the castle, we get disoriented, turned around. It doesn't make any sense. Do you two know how to get there? Ellie gave a nod to Milo. Grimar knows the way. We can lead you there, said Milo. Hyzia exchanged a few words with Duintas in a hushed tone. Before we proceed, there is something that troubles us, Duintas said, his voice wary. He turned to Grimar. If you would reveal your face, it would help us feel more comfortable in trusting you. Milo stepped in quickly, his tone firm. Grimar has his reasons for his anonymity, but I assure you, he is trustworthy. He saved my life and brought me this far. He will reveal himself when the time is right. If Milo says he can be trusted, then he can be trusted, Losgrel barked from behind them, his voice gruff but unwavering. Very well. We have little choice in the matter anyhow. Now that your reunion is over, perhaps we can make some actual progress, said Duintas as he glanced briefly at Destira. Grimar and Milo moved to the front, and the group began walking through the valley. Towering snow-capped mountains loomed on all sides, their peaks piercing the sky. Soon, the group approached a fast-moving brook. Grimar veered slightly to the right, following the stream northeast. The brook connected onto a larger river which ran north to south. There, they crossed the brook and headed north. It's just ahead, Grimar whispered. They walked for another 5 minutes before Grimar stopped, his finger pointing toward the far side of the river. There, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I don't see anything, Duintas said, scanning the landscape with confusion. Neither do I, Milo added, narrowing his eyes. Grimar took a slow, deliberate breath and drew a wand from his belt. He whispered an incantation, his words barely a murmur in the cool air. A cascade of shifting light, every hue imaginable, burst from the wand, streaking across the river and dispersing in many directions. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. First, a bridge of stone and earth materialized, stretching from where they stood to the far side of the river, winding its way up a steep hill. Then, from the very heart of the hill, a castle began to take shape, its presence emerging like a beast awakening from slumber. Milo looked on in awe and gasped. This wasn't at all what he had expected. He had imagined something akin to the great library of Edriaxlin, elegant, symmetrical, grand in its architectural complexity. But this was something else entirely. The castle seemed to pulse with life, as though it had grown organically from the mountain itself, its contours rough and irregular, defying any conventional notion of design. It was earthy, its walls a patchwork of browns and grays, like the very stone had conspired with the land to rise up. There was little symmetry or calculated order. It was something wild, untamed. Turrets of varying sizes and shapes sprouted from the castle, their cone-shaped roofs blanketed in snow. The windows, too, were strange, having lights like eyes, unblinking and eternal, seeming to watch over the land. Some glimmered with the warmth of light, while others were shrouded in shadow, their expressions unreadable. Some windows seemed to glare down with fury, others impassive, as if indifferent to the world around them. The turrets and stonework were draped in a beard of pale, moss-like growth, giving the entire structure a look of aged wisdom. And all of it, castle, mountain, sky, seemed to glow with an otherworldly orange hue. It's beautiful, Hyzia murmured, her voice tinged with awe. The group stood in silence for a moment, taking in the sight. Milo could feel the weight of the place in the air, an almost oppressive stillness hanging over them. The castle didn't just occupy the space, it dominated it. Grimar broke the silence, his voice soft but insistent. Proceed carefully as you cross the bridge. If we can see the castle, they can see us. The group moved forward, cautiously stepping onto the bridge. The stone creaked underfoot as they crossed toward what appeared to be the main entrance of the castle. But before they could reach it, figures emerged from the shadows. 2 archers stepped out from the right, crossbows aimed squarely at them. Alongside them were 2 hooded men, their hands gripping wizard staffs, their gazes calculating. "Halt," one of the robed men barked. "Who goes there? Who goes there?" "We wish to attend the gathering," Duintas replied, his voice steady, though his eyes flicked warily toward the men with crossbows. "Do any of you have an invitation?" the second robed man asked, his tone skeptical. Duintas reached into his cloak and handed over Burdoc's letter. The man took it, unfolding it with a careful motion. He and his companion read it thoroughly, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. "This is not an invitation," the first man said, his voice low, almost accusing. "Is this meant to suggest that some of you are from Wolflandia?" He glanced at Ellie, his eyes narrowing. "And you, unshroud your face immediately." Grimar exchanged a look with Milo, then turned to the Wolflandians. "You must," Milo said quietly, his voice tense. With a resigned sigh, Grimar reached for his wand. The moment his fingers touched it, crossbows were drawn tighter, and wizard staffs shifted to ready positions. "Only to break the spell," Grimar said, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. Slowly, one of the wizards commanded, his voice sharp with authority. Grimar nodded and, after a brief pause, whispered the incantation. The veil around Ellie's face lifted, revealing her true identity. As her features emerged, the 2 Wolflandians went still, their eyes wide in recognition. Ellie met their gaze, her voice trembling. "Please," she whispered, "you mustn't tell anyone that I am still alive." For a long moment, the group stood in stunned silence. Milo could see the shock written across their faces. To the others, it was as though they had seen a ghost, an apparition they had long believed to be lost. Finally, the tension broke with an abrupt command. "Enough," the robed man called out. "Which of you are from Wolflandia?" Distira, Hyzia, and Duintas all raised their hands in unison, each with a resigned look in their eyes. "And you, miss?" The robed man's gaze locked onto Ellie. "I am from Westwood," Ellie said softly, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Westwood?" The 2 men exchanged a brief, hushed conversation. One of them's eyes widened in recognition. "She bears the silver streak of the Vastiles. You're the daughter of Tristia?" Ellie nodded, her face a mask of reluctant acceptance. "What is the meaning of all this?" one of the men demanded, his voice hard and impatient. "Let them stay in the dungeon until we get all this sorted out," said the other, his tone equally grim. Longfellow's heart sank. Not again, he thought, remembering the dread of Raybor's dismal dungeon. The mouth-shaped gate creaked open with a groan, and they were ushered inside, the cold stone walls closing in around them. They were searched thoroughly, their weapons and magical items confiscated with military precision. "You will inform Burdock that I'm here, won't you?" Milo asked, his voice tight with restrained frustration. "I assure you, we'll conduct a thorough investigation," said the man coldly. "He is expecting me," Milo pressed, hoping his urgency would push them to act more swiftly. The men exchanged an unreadable glance before nodding and separating them into different rooms, each locked behind heavy doors and guarded closely. Meanwhile, Glintrar, one of the wizards escorting Milo and the others, walked briskly toward the headmaster's quarters. He gave the door a sharp knock. The door creaked open, revealing a man whose size seemed to fill the room. Hiram Ivanar, the headmaster, was as imposing as his reputation, tall and broad-shouldered, his silver blonde hair gleaming in the light. His cheerful blue eyes, however, betrayed a warmth and strength that contrasted with his intimidating stature. "This had better be good," Ivanar said with a slight frown. "Luria and I were just settling down for afternoon tea." "Forgive me," most exalted, Glintrar replied, bowing slightly. "But we have some unusual guests who require a particular handling." "Particular handling?" Ivanar raised an eyebrow, his voice laced with curiosity. "Sounds complicated," he mused. "Perhaps." "One of them carried this letter," Glintrar said, handing him the parchment. Ivanar's gaze flicked to the seal. "Burdock the Red?" He glanced over at his wife, Luria, before turning back to the letter. "Interesting." His eyes narrowed slightly as he examined it more closely. "If you would be so kind as to find Burdock, I'll be waiting in the Hall of Enchantment." "Yes, most exalted," Glintrar answered, turning to leave. Glintrar found Burdock on a secluded balcony, staring out at the distant mountains, his posture tense, lost in thought. "Burdock," Glintrar called, his voice cutting through the silence. "The headmaster requests your presence in the Hall of Enchantment." Burdock didn't turn at first. "Oh, what is this about?" he asked, his gaze still fixed on the peaks beyond. "We have guests who claim to know you," Glintrar replied, stepping forward. "Can you say who?" Burdock asked, his voice casual, though there was a note of curiosity in it. "Mello or Milo, something like that," Glintrar said, his brow furrowed as he struggled to remember. "Milo." Burdock's eyes widened in sudden recognition. He pushed himself off the stone railing and started moving quickly, his steps brisk. "Yes, that's it," Glintrar confirmed, following close behind. Milo, here, Burdock muttered to himself, quickening his pace. Burdock entered the Hall of Enchantment and was greeted by the sight of Ivanar, Luria, Rowler the Wise, and another wizard whom Burdock didn't recognize. Their presence felt formal, the air thick with expectation. "Where's Milo?" Burdock demanded, his tone sharp, his gaze scanning the room for any sign of the young man. "Please sit," Ivanar said with a polite, almost amused smile, gesturing to a chair. "First," Ivanar said, his voice firm but calm, "one of our guests carried this letter." He handed the parchment over to Burdock. Burdock barely glanced at it before his eyes shot up. "Losgrel? Longfellow? They're here too?" he asked, his voice tight with surprise. He moved closer to the table, his chair scraping slightly against the floor. "They are. But first we must discuss the matter of your recent actions. This letter alone has violated 2, maybe 3 of the codes of the Orr," said Ivanar. "There were extenuating circumstances," Burdock began, trying to justify himself. "Any of you would have done the same thing. None of the others from the guild could be found, so I acted. I made the decision," he said, conveniently leaving out the fact he sent Longfellow and Losgrel ahead without first searching for any wizards from the guild to consult with. "Perhaps if you weren't gallivanting all over Midlandia, Burdock," Ivanar interrupted, his voice tinged with frustration, "you would have received a briefing on current events. And perhaps you would have been reminded of the request to refrain from taking any actions without prior approval." "I had been checking my mail regularly, and I never received any such letter," the Red Wizard said, his voice rising in agitation. "And even if I had, I might have very well taken the same actions." "Your actions have put all of us at risk, Burdock," Ivanar replied sternly, his eyes narrowing. "Have my actions caused any actual harm?" Burdock asked, challenging him. "No," Ivanar conceded, "at least not yet." Burdock's frustration deepened. "When can I see Milo?" "They're bringing the 7 up shortly," Ivanar explained. "We'll interview them one at a time and try to make sense of all this." First to be interviewed was Losgrel. Known for his reputation of honesty and ethics, at least with Burdock and Rowler, he told them everything that had happened. He spoke of their debt to Wolflandia, which would be forgiven if they brought the representatives to the gathering. He also shared a troubling rumor: the walled city had been taken, though the details were vague and shrouded in mystery. Next, Longfellow entered. He broke down into tears as he recounted their ordeal in the dark, grim dungeons of Wolflandia. He pleaded with them not to return him to the detention room, despite it being far less unpleasant than the horrors he had experienced. The 3 Wolflandians followed, each telling a similar story. They seemed genuine enough to warrant further investigation, though their sincerity still left some questions lingering. Then it was Milo's turn. He entered the room with a smile that seemed to brighten the otherwise tense atmosphere. He walked straight to Burdock and gave him a warm hug before sitting down across from him. "You won't believe the stories I have to tell you," Milo exclaimed, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "We would all love to hear them," Ivanar said, his voice polite, but his tone suggesting urgency. "But first, we have a couple of questions for you." Burdock leaned forward. "If I may, where's Jack?" "We got separated when the witch." "The witch?" Ivanar interrupted, his brow furrowing. "Hold on, let's start from the beginning. Let's begin with the last time you saw Burdock." Milo nodded and recounted his story, how old Whitfurrows had warned him about the witch, how he lost Jack, and how Holt Thor had saved him, only for him to find Ellie later. "Incredible," Burdock murmured, wide-eyed with amazement. "So," Ivanar pressed, "you had no idea this person was Alida, and you've had no contact with her between your leaving the walled city and the point when you arrived at the ferry?" "No," Milo said, shaking his head. "I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw she was still alive." "And you have no feelings for her anymore?" Burdock asked, a trace of concern in his voice. "No," Milo replied, his tone firm. "There are memories, but—" "But?" Ivanar prompted. "But she was deceitful," Milo said, his voice hardening. "She lied to me, and I'm not sure I could ever trust her again." "So, should we not trust her then?" Ivanar asked, his voice measured. I think she's on our side," Milo said cautiously. "At least, we share a common enemy. She saved me from the witch and brought me here. I owe her my gratitude, but beyond that, I can't say whether you should trust her." Ivanar regarded Milo carefully before nodding. "Fair enough. Would you please send her in?" As Milo left, Ivanar spoke quietly to Burdock. "I'm afraid she can't be trusted. We may need to turn her away." "Let's hear what she has to say, at least," Burdock whispered, a note of hope in his voice. "Milo is a good judge of character." Ellie entered the room with a scornful look on her face, her arms crossed defensively. She surveyed the group coldly before taking a seat. "You have the look of your father," Glintrar remarked, his tone nostalgic. Ellie's eyes narrowed. "You knew my father?" "A very long time ago," Glintrar replied, his gaze softening. "I admired your father. But your mother, are you aware of the evil?" "We are all aware," Burdock interjected quickly, his voice tight. It would be more expedient to focus on the present situation. I'm going to be straightforward with you, Ivanar began, his tone heavy. I don't think you can be trusted. I'm inclined to have you escorted away from this gathering. But I'll hear you out. Burdock's eyes dropped to the table, disappointment etched across his face. Ellie met his gaze, unflinching. I just want to say, my sister is a powerful witch. Probably more powerful than most of you. Who among you would dare stand against her one-on-one? She's the enemy's most dangerous weapon. You need someone to balance that power. I know her weaknesses, her power. I came here to help you in this fight, not to cause you trouble. Sending me away would be foolish. She stared at each of the wizards present, her gaze unwavering. You need me. Ivanar studied her intently before speaking. I sense you're very dangerous. We don't know you, and we simply can't trust you. Ellie's eyes flashed with indignation. You know what, I think, she said, her voice rising. I think you're just jealous that my family are natural-born wizards who possess the full power of the Ore. Many of our wizards possess the fullness of the Ore. Ivanar retorted sharply, his patience wearing thin. A word please, said R'hllor, stepping in to intervene. R'hllor and Ivanar moved to the far side of the room to confer privately. Ivanar, R'hllor said quietly, dangerous she may be, but I sense she's also very wise. It might be prudent let her stay, under guard if need be. It's a risk, Ivanar replied, his voice low. More of risk to let her go, R'hllor countered. She could join other side. Ivanar stroked his silvery blonde beard, deep in thought. R'hllor the wise, you most certainly are. I'll trust your judgment. But she must be under close watch. A room near yours, alongside Milo. Agreed, R'hllor said firmly. The two returned to the table and Ivanar addressed Ellie. You may go back out with the others for now. After a brief exchange, the wizards called the seven back into the room. Ivanar stood, his voice firm and commanding. The good news is, you are all welcome to stay and attend the meeting in 2 days' time. No one will be turned away today. You will have voting rights and speaking rights. He paused, scanning the room. However, since none of you were officially invited, and for reasons of safety and security, we must keep a close watch on you. You will not be allowed to roam the premises without an escort. But rest assured, your privacy and personal space will be respected. Your basic needs will be taken care of until you choose to leave. The first priority is to get you all examined by our physician, Ivanar said, his tone warm yet firm. I know the journey was long and taxing, especially for Milo, who undertook most of it alone. After that, you'll be provided with a hearty meal, one I think you'll find quite satisfying. After the 7 guests were sent off to see the physician, the headmaster tasked a servant with spreading the word of an emergency meeting. Wizards and non-wizards alike were instructed to gather in the Hall of Splendor within the hour. The hall was much larger than the Hall of Enchantment, spacious enough to accommodate everyone, guests included. The Hall of Splendor, located at the heart of the castle on the first floor, was an awe-inspiring space. Its large, domed ceiling was adorned with artwork depicting the world's creation, as understood by the wizards. At the far end of the hall, a raised stage stood ready, and chairs were arranged around the space, filling the room with a sense of anticipation. As the guests filtered in and took their seats, Ivanar ascended the stage and waited. All right, I think we're all here now, he began, his voice carrying across the hall. Well, perhaps I was wrong, he said as a few latecomers filtered into the room. After another moment, he held up his hand. Let's begin. Quiet, please. A hushed silence fell. I want to thank you all for coming on such short notice, Ivanar began, his tone serious. I bring some very alarming news. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. There has been some form of rebellion at the walled city of Idriaxlan. Unfortunately, we know very little at this time. We don't understand the full scope of the rebellion or the potential consequences it may bring. The annual meeting is set for the day after tomorrow, and we will conduct a thorough investigation then, but until that time, we will be relying on what we can gather in other ways. Ivanar's expression hardened. Not all wizards possess psychic abilities, and not all who have such abilities are wizards. But I ask everyone, wizards and guests alike, to pay close attention to your dreams, daydreams, intrusive thoughts, or anything else that may offer insight into what is happening. He paused again, his gaze stern. I want to remind you that trying to force a vision is the surest way to block one. Let it come naturally. What is called for now is openness and attentiveness. Be alert, be receptive. He looked over the crowd, eyes intense. I will now open the floor for questions. Please, keep them related to the topic at hand. A few questions were asked, and the room buzzed with the quiet hum of conversation as the wizards and guests debated what little they knew. After a short discussion, the guests were dismissed, and Milo returned to his room. He lay down, exhaustion settling deep within him, and fell into the deepest sleep he had had in weeks. The next morning, Burdock and R'hllor came to Milo's room, knocking softly before entering. Milo, do you have a moment to talk? Burdock asked, his voice low but urgent. Of course, Milo replied, sitting up quickly. Rowler asked, stepping in before things could escalate further. Oops. I appear to be glitching. Blame Microsoft. The two wizards entered, and Burdock laid a map of Ash Dorn on the small table between them. We wanted to discuss Jack, Burdock began, his finger tracing the map. Rowler and I believe that the witch must have cast some kind of spell on either you or Jack to separate the two of you. Of course. That makes sense, Milo said, nodding thoughtfully. Burdock's eyes scanned the map. When was the last time you saw or heard from Jack? He asked, glancing up at Milo. Milo paused, recalling the events. Let's see. I was fishing here, near the river, when the witch came. I found a boat and sailed downstream. I was supposed to meet Jack here, at the mouth of the river, but he never showed. I was afraid the witch would find me, so I decided to head north as Whitfurrows instructed. Burdock and Rowler exchanged a brief, silent glance. Burdock spoke first. There's a field not far from where you were. Hopefully Jack is there. But it's also possible he went south, seeking warmer weather. I can't be certain. Rowler leaned forward, his brow furrowing. After the meeting, I'll ride with Spirit Glider to search for Jack and break the spell. It's likely we'll find him soon enough. Burdock nodded. Depending on the outcome of the meeting, you may be able to ride out and reunite with him as well. Milo's eyes brightened with hope, but doubt still lingered. The spell can be broken? Burdock's expression softened. It's not a difficult spell to undo. These types of enchantments are rarely permanent. They may even wear off in a matter of weeks. There's no need to worry. He paused, his gaze shifting toward the door. Now, how about getting some food? You've earned a good meal, I'd say. Meanwhile, in the Hall of Sustenance, Ivanar, his wife, and a few other wizards were enjoying their breakfast when a young red-haired man nervously approached their table. Excuse me, most exalted, the young man stammered. I am Pheolin Ferrand, representing the island of Ari. Please, join us, Pheolin, Ivanar interrupted with a warm gesture. What's on your mind? He asked as the young man sat. Pheolin hesitated before speaking again. At the meeting last night, you asked us to pay attention to our dreams, and... Yes, go on, Ivanar encouraged, his interest piqued. Well, last night I had a strange dream. I'm not sure if it means anything, but... Pheolin faltered. I saw an army of Atlanteans marching west. One of them carried a blue flag with the symbol of Doka. Ivanar's brow furrowed. Did you see anything else? No, that was it. Does it mean something? It may, Ivanar replied, his voice quiet but intense. Thank you for bringing this to me. He turned to the other wizards at the table, locking eyes with each of them. Tell no one else of this. Do you understand? Yes, of course, Pheolin said, visibly relieved to be trusted. Thank you, Ivanar said, his gaze lingering on the young man for a moment before he stood to leave. Once Pheolin had departed, Ivanar leaned back in his chair, his face thoughtful. Could this be true? Could Doka really be recruiting an army of Atlanteans? It's possible, his wife replied, her tone laced with concern. It's certainly fortunate that we didn't vote to invite them. The annual meeting was now just one day away. Though Pheolin's vision was troubling, it wasn't enough to warrant immediate action. Preparations for tomorrow's event continued in earnest, with everyone focused on what was to come. For the rest of the day, Milo, Losgrel, and Longfellow exchanged stories, laughing and drinking delicious mead brewed by the wizards. The atmosphere was light, but an undercurrent of tension still lingered, especially for Milo, who couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty about what lay ahead. Ellie, however, was bitter about being treated like a prisoner. She brooded in silence, glaring at the guards who watched her every move. When she wasn't being scrutinized, she spent her time staring at the farm animals grazing on the southern lawn of the castle, her mind distant and restless. Night fell, and everyone retired early in preparation for the meeting the next morning, which would take place right after breakfast. The following morning in the Hall of Sustenance, most of the guests and wizards were already seated when Milo and the other uninvited guests were escorted in. They sat together at one table, and plates were brought to them. Milo noticed some people from another table staring at them, and his eyes locked with Anaras, the one who had once claimed he brought evil. The look Anaras shot him now made Milo feel uneasy, like a weight pressing down on his chest. Anaras and the others at the table began to murmur among themselves, their eyes never leaving Milo. He felt the heat of their stares and wished for the meal to pass quickly. After breakfast, the announcement was made for everyone to proceed to the third floor and into the Hall of the Great Void. As Milo climbed the spiral stairs, he glanced out the window and saw the same vantage point where he'd first glimpsed the castle in the distance. What a journey, he thought, his mind momentarily drifting before he continued upward. The Hall of the Great Void was even larger than the one on the first floor. Its dome was painted to resemble the sky on a perfect spring day, giving the space an airy, expansive feel. Seats were arranged around the hall, elevated on the north, west, and south sides, the ones closest to the walls being the highest. In the east, a gigantic throne dominated the room, seated atop a grand stage. Two smaller ornate chairs flanked the throne, and to the south, west, and north, thrones half its size were arranged in a semicircle. At the very center of the room, a massive marble table held a large scroll. Milo took his seat on the north side of the hall, near the wall. As the room filled, a low murmur of conversation rose, but it gradually died down as the last guests entered and took their places. The bioluminescent lights dimmed, and silence fell. The creaking of a door opening broke the stillness, and a procession of wizards, led by Hiram Ivanar, made their way into the hall. Strange, ethereal music played as they entered, and each wizard was dressed in elaborately embroidered robes of greenish-blue, the color of turquoise. Ivanar's robe had white trim, and each wizard carried a staff topped with a unique amulet, their necks adorned with jewelry bearing various symbols. One by one, the wizards broke off from the procession and took their places at their various stations until finally, Ivanar himself ascended to the great throne. The wizards remained standing, and the music slowly faded away. The bioluminescent lights brightened, casting the hall in a soft glow. Ivanar raised his hands, and the clapping from the gathered crowd soon quieted. "The time has finally arrived," he began, his voice resonating through the hall. Applause erupted, and Ivanar raised a hand to still the crowd. "Thank you. I'm grateful to see you all here. I wanted everyone present for the great procession, but as the opening and closing of this meeting cannot be witnessed by non-wizards, I must apologize for the inconvenience." A ripple of murmurs passed through the hall as Ivanar continued. "I ask all non-wizards and magical folk who are not formally invited to follow the marshal. He will escort you to another room while we conduct the opening ritual. Once again, my sincerest apologies for the inconvenience." The marshal, a tall and charismatic figure, stepped forward. With a smile, he made his way to each section, escorting non-magical guests and making sure they were treated with the utmost courtesy as he guided them out of the hall. "Please sit," he said to the gathered guests. "The opening ritual will take only 15 minutes. After that, I will return to gather you." With a bow, he returned to the hall, leaving the guests to settle in. As Milo took his seat next to Losgrel and Longfellow, a quiet sense of comfort settled over him. Despite the tension in the air and the uncertainty of what lay ahead, there was something reassuring about being with friends, people who had shared the trials of the journey and who, like him, had also faced the unknown. For the first time in what felt like ages, the weight on Milo's shoulders seemed a little lighter. Against all odds, he had made it to the wizard gathering, and against all expectations, he was once again united with his companions. Even though it might be the breath before a storm, he felt utter gratitude and repose in the moment he now found himself in. End of Walls of Destiny Part 2.